Hello and welcome to 3PL Operations Best Practices, Optimizing Your Receiving Workflows. This is an educational session where we're going to explain why more efficient operations are now a must for today's 3PLs looking to grow, especially around the receiving process. My name is Michael Evans, and I'm Group Editorial Director for Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, which of course includes Modern Materials Handling Magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Is being brought to you by 3PL Central. Now, it's safe to say that every logistics professional joining us today is feeling the pressure that e-commerce has introduced into their warehouse operations, and that pressure is only going to grow. In fact, e-commerce retail drove 40% of total omni-channel sales growth in 2018 alone, and it's certainly not showing any signs of slowing down anytime soon. Now, indeed, e-commerce has brought with it great complexity, but it's also brought great opportunity along with it, especially inside today's 3PL operations, where managers are looking to streamline omni-channel order fulfillment while establishing a more efficient strategy to accommodate smoother inbound flow as well as next-day and same-day delivery windows in many cases. And to do this successfully, 3PLs must innovate, adapt, and evolve, as we say across the pages of Modern, or they're going to get edged out of the market position. And to remain successful, 3PL managers do need to adhere to some practical best practices to optimize operations, and that's just what we're going to share today. Now, today, to help us along this path, we're joined by David Miller, and David is General Manager of Platform Services at 3PL Central. David is going to touch on some best practices for optimizing receiving workflows and achieving more efficient warehouse layouts. He's also going to share some insights into paperless receiving workflows and automation, and he's also going to take a look at best practices to simplifying and automated billing. Now, this is all with the goal of offering practical steps to optimizing productivity in an effort to help differentiate your 3PL operations in these increasingly challenging and competitive times. Now, just a quick note before David gets us started. We're going to have time for a quick Q&A session after David is through with his presentation. So please make sure to submit your questions at any time. We're going to get to as many following the presentation, but if we don't get to your question, we're certainly going to package all those questions up, and David will be able to get to you via email following today's presentation. So David, without any further ado, the podium is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Love the intro. It always helps me keep my word count down when someone sets things up so nicely for me. Definitely excited to be here today with Modern Materials Handling to present this webinar on best practices and optimizing your warehouse receiving workflows. Just a quick note about 3PL Central. We're a leader in warehouse management solutions for the 3PL industry. We typically partner with our customers and help them quickly transform their warehouses into real service leadership. And we do that by empowering our customers to actually serve their customers better, operate more efficiently, and really start to scale to meet the increasing demands of the 3PL industry. So as Mike teed up, we are here to talk about sort of the best practices around optimizing your receiving workflows. We're going to go through and we're going to present along the lines of efficiencies of warehouse layout and directed put away, paperless receiving workflows and automation, and simplifying automated billable events. And what's interesting is we serve clients across the entire 3PL spectrum: pure e-commerce, pure B2B, retail replenishment, and omni-channel. And what we found is that actually these three categories are where all of those different types of warehouse businesses actually solidify are on very similar best practices. So we're excited to share with you some of the feedback that we've got from sort of our expansive network of 3PLs and as we've been able to track their growth over time. Okay. So we're going to start talking about the physical layout of a warehouse and using automation like directed put away to help set a warehouse up for success on the receiving side of the operation. And what we found is that proper receiving really is the foundation to efficient warehouse operations. High-performing warehouses that have optimized their warehouse layout and space utilization always report significant efficiency gains along the lines of the receiving process, and that's actually coupled with exponential efficiency gains on the shipping side of the business as well. These high-performing warehouses, they also report greater employee productivity due to system-directed put away instead of sort of relying on just a warehouseman to simply locate inventory in the first available location. Directed put away helps maximize the space utilization, calculates the optimal fill levels without exceeding that point of diminishing returns. It's funny, you can actually have too much of a good thing if you overstack locations. It actually makes you less efficient. So using things like directed put away and these best practices, it's going to help us minimize discrepancies, damage, and shrinkage, and even eliminate some of the compliance issues that some of our customers may be facing in the 3PL world. So knowing the best practice receiving is key to supporting high volume outputs and compliance. We always get asked, how do customers build and enforce those procedures? Now, there's a couple components to that. The first thing is I'd like to point out that warehouse footprints, they're growing very quickly, right? As new buildings are going up, square footage is getting bigger, ceiling heights are going up, more racking is being installed. And managing all of that space in an efficient way, it really requires tools to be able to do that. And I'll also go on the record and say that if your warehouse is even of a more modest size, right, a standard square footage, having the tools and the automation around maximizing that space almost becomes even more important because there's just no room or there's no margin for error to squeeze every last bit of capacity out of your locations. So what we're looking at here is an example of what I would call a small warehouse layout, but it really packs in a lot of value-added services. Apart from your standard floor and racking storage here, we've also incorporated sort of a bonded cage area, maybe a high-value vault, and then some temperature-controlled storage, right? Very complex, but I think you guys get the idea. And if you think about it, if a typical warehouse has this sort of setup, and they haven't really embraced the idea of directed put away or receiving automation, that business is going to be reliant on, at best, a supervisor, and at worst, honestly, a temporary employee to locate every item that comes into the facility. So you can see with this level of complexity, the potential for massive inefficiencies and errors to occur, it's almost a given. So I guess I would say that the best practice here dictates a set of rules around warehouse locations and items. And when you apply those two sets of rules correctly, it really should enable a system to direct the warehouseman where to put each item and take that decision out of someone's hands that you don't want them making. All right, so a couple of examples of that we see across sort of the industry would be items and commodities that are designated as something like temperature controlled, right? If you think about it, you can automatically direct specific items to a specific location, be it refrigerated or frozen. And you no longer need to rely on something like tribal knowledge around understanding, does this cucumber get stored at 34 degrees or 45 degrees, right? There's automations that can help you with those things and, again, takes that decision out of the wrong person's hands. Similarly, high-volume items can automatically be directed to a high-value cage. And check-in processes can confirm that it gets there, reducing things like shrinkage and loss. We also see a lot of things like bonded freight. Where if you have a CFS station, freight may come in bond or out of bond. You need to move things from one area to another. Again, this takes all of that compliance challenge and guesswork out of the equation because systems can actually automate based on rules that you would set up, again, inside of your warehouse management system. But the idea here is, again, we're trying to take that decision out of the hands of people that probably shouldn't be making it. On a lighter note, we also see some really interesting things along sort of workflow-driven needs, mandatory QC, automatically pulling inventory out into a quarantine location, being able to count it before putting back into a general POP is a pretty popular function that warehouses are doing as a value-added services today. And then the other one that I've seen recently is sort of this idea of cross-docking, where we've seen warehouses literally receive in all inventory from an inbound, put those products away, only to immediately have to pull them back out of storage to put them on an outbound shipment. So you can imagine how inefficient that would be, especially if you knew what needed to ship before you received. And honestly, it kind of goes beyond inefficiency, and it starts to be demoralizing, right? Like, how much extra work are we going to do? So I would say this, a lot of those scenarios that we just talked about, they can get pretty intense. And so normally when we start talking to warehouses about the concept of directed put away, the first thing that we start with is just what's the best practice? So if you don't have a lot of those real compliance issues around cold storage or bonded freight, et cetera, sort of the best path forward is to set up your rules around directed put away to minimize your travel time, right? So the being able to sort of optimize for an outbound process based on how you receive and where you receive to is usually where you're going to get the most significant return on investment. And honestly, it's one of the easiest things to implement. Okay, so our next set of best practices is revolving around paperless receiving workflows and automation. And we also often get asked, when you say paperless warehousing, do you mean barcode scanning? And I guess I would say that barcode scanning is definitely a solid component of paperless receiving and paperless operations, but there's actually a whole lot more to it nowadays. So when warehouses are talking about paperless receiving and operations, it really layers into system-driven tasks in mobile computing, right? It's all about keeping the warehouse and the office in sync in real time and streamlining some of that communication. Think about sort of paperless options to take advantage of manufacturer-applied labels, electronic ASNs, knowing how to match things like expected and actuals, right? That's also part of sort of the paperless processing flow today. A little bit unexpected, but actually paperless processing, it helps empower your employees, right? It gives them access to data when they need it, right, and allows them to actually leverage their love of technology. And so nowadays, no one's scared of a mobile device anymore, but they do expect that they're going to have an intuitive experience with it, and they do expect that it's going to help them with their daily tasks. And sort of the final part around implementing best practices with paperless processing is going to be the ability to benchmark and improve workflows by capturing and analyzing real-time KPI data. That's ultimately going to help us make better business decisions and make them faster. So we mentioned that paperless receiving goes beyond barcode scanning, and it really starts to encompass a way of communicating between what happens in the warehouse and the office, and what happens within the four walls of the 3PL and really the rest of their connected ecosystem, as well as with their customer. So paperless receiving allows for really task-driven mobile workflows, scheduling and reprioritizing operations on the fly based on what's happening throughout the day, like what changes are coming. What's coming in? What are we expecting? Who should we assign to unload a particular container? How long is it going to take, right? It's almost getting this understanding of that prioritization of what's the most important task and being able on a moment's notice to sort of make those changes on the fly. Paperless receiving uses task-based assignments to gather immediate feedback from the floor through that two-way communication. Again, what's the status of a current DVAN? We can watch that progress happen if we're using paperless tasks. Who created new items, right? Did the put away get completed? In high-performing warehouses, this is all happening in real time using paperless processing options. Other advantages of paperless receiving in mobile applications is really the ability to expand workflow requirements through other applications, right? So if you talk about connecting systems through an API and through some of those paperless processing, it really allows you to build in very specific workflows, especially when one size doesn't fit all when you're managing for multiple customers. So we also talk about smart inputs. And from a warehouse's perspective, knowing what it expects to receive can be just as important as knowing what's actually being received. And so typically before receiving anything, a high-performing warehouse is going to require some sort of advanced shipment notification or ASN. Now, this helps the warehouse plan for labor, equipment, dock space. Like, you need to know all of these things. And it's actually worth noting that every expected inbound document, it exists somewhere in electronic format. So if you're still receiving emailed PDF files as your ASN, like that's going to become a limiter in your receiving efficiency. It just is. Somewhere in the pipeline, be it the customer, the manufacturer, the supplier, they should be able to provide you some sort of electronic document that can serve as an ASN. Now, maybe that's through EDI, and that's great. Like there's formal processes around that. But even if you're getting some sort of flat file that you can start to key in off of versus a PDF, that's just one more step in the right direction. And I'd also go to say that you having that information as the warehouse is just as beneficial for your customer and those suppliers as it is for you. Other areas that we've kind of categorized under smart inputs would be things like unique identification of containers, products, units, License plate labels at that pallet level. This is a great example of a unique identifier that really helps optimize the receiving and put away process. If you're using sort of those predefined labels with multiple data points, it really allows for sort of faster receiving with minimal scanning, whether you're using barcode parsing or you just have more access to more data, allowing that warehouseman to locate, move, stage, and even ship that product out using sort of that one parent value, as opposed to having to dig down into every piece of granularity of what's on that pallet. Something like a license plate label, it also helps track things like dynamic changes. So as warehouse pallets are being moved, things are being put away, validations are happening. If that product is labeled as it comes in during that receiving process, either from the supplier or at the warehouse level, right, having that level of sort of data and parent consolidation around a unit, it really provides the highest level of visibility throughout every touch point from the time you receive to the time that you ship. And so I know that we're talking about labeling, and maybe it's not entirely paperless because, yes, you're printing something, and yes, it's applied. Hopefully the manufacturer is doing that for you so you don't need to worry about it inside of the warehouse. But a trend that we're starting to see is taking that typical 4x6 quote-unquote pallet label or license plate and expanding that out more to sort of a placard size. And the great thing about having a larger label on that pallet or that product is, yes, it's going to incorporate all of the barcodes and the data efficiency and everything else, but it also allows for a lot of human readable data to be made available. And what's great about that is if you have warehousemen that don't always have a connected device, they're still able to participate in the inventory process because they have enough information about what they're seeing and what they're doing to be able to make at least an educated decision as to what to do next. And it's kind of a good way to marry that high-tech scanning along with old-school visibility. So, we talked a little bit about how paperless processing actually helps empower your employees. In this day and age, everybody has a connected device, and it really starts to provide the visibility to the needs of the business, right? And if you can also provide tools that are needed to affect change based on that visibility, and warehouse employees, they love it. They eat it up, and they actually do things with some of the tools and technology that you never would have thought anyone would just adapt to organically. A good example of this would be in the case of a shifted load, which is what we're looking at here on this screen. Honestly, capturing that image and attaching it to a transaction is easy as taking a selfie these days, right? So now when the customer asks, well, why was I charged a pallet rework fee on this receipt, right? The proof has been super well documented, and it was easy, and it was done in real time, and it was done by the guys on the warehouse floor. Didn't need to involve a manager, a supervisor, the back office. Those things just happen. So when it comes to paperless receiving, I would say that most warehouses do opt for what I would call the warehouse-grade mobile computer, something that would have long-range scanners and imagers. This would be something along the lines of your Motorola devices or your Zebra devices. Particularly on the receiving side and the put-away side, those are pretty arduous operations, right? Things are getting banged around. There's containers and trucks and forklifts. So something that can really take a beating would be preferable in those instances. But that being said, when you start mixing in like non-receiving processes such as the pick, the pack, the ship, those are going to have different technology needs. So you may need a mix of different mobile devices to really find that right combination of performance and price for every part of your operation, depending on who's doing what within the warehouse. All right. So this is a really simple slide, but honestly, benchmarking and improvement is kind of the unsung hero of sort of the paperless process. If you think about capturing data in real time and being able to benchmark against that, it provides a whole level of business visibility that you probably haven't had before or wouldn't have without the paperless processing. So using mobile devices to automatically track things like employee utilization, processing efficiency, sometimes those things are just afterthoughts because, after all, people on the floor, we just want to scan stuff in. We want to validate that we got the right stuff. We need to get it put away, and we want to do it as fast as possible. But having the data behind all of those processes, right, that you can actually measure and manage the profitability of your customers, the performance of your employees, and the overall health of your operation, right, having that real-time data and easy access to those data points, it's really what allows high-performing warehouses to benchmark how well are they performing today, right, institute changes, iterate and measure those improvements, right? If you don't have that level of visibility, it takes far too long to understand if what you're doing is working or if it's not, right? And so being empowered with data captured through paperless warehousing or paperless receiving processes, right, it just allows for better business visibility and resource planning. So I'd say this, from a best practice perspective on like paperless warehousing and data collection, it always makes sense to use a system that's going to collect and interpret the data that's really important for your specific operation, right? Like there's lots of ways to do this. There's lots of different avenues you can take. Everyone's operation is going to be a little bit different, and you're all going to prioritize something that's important for your business. So again, having the tools that can actually collect and interpret that data for you are going to be important to you sort of maximizing what's happening through that paperless process. All right, so, for the 3PL warehouse, hopefully, as we mentioned before, you've received that ASN and you know what to expect ahead of time. But it's usually at the time that the receiving services actually start, the inventory is going into the warehouse, that you can actually start to bill for those tasks, right? And that's where the billing and the charges start to accrue. So we're finding that in today's high-performing warehouses, they're really moving towards a simplified tariff that looks to reduce exceptions and almost lead to 100% system automated billing. So, historically we've seen a pattern amongst 3PLs where they land a new client, and the client comes to them and they bring their rate sheet from their previous 3PL and they say, beat this pricing. And it leaves very little room to either negotiate or restructure that tariff. And so I've just always been a little bit challenged by this, because if the previous 3PL was sort of unable to meet those service demands at the price that this customer was expecting, it's just a big red flag that this current or the new 3PL is also going to struggle, right? Your hand is sort of forced by that customer. So what's great about having all of this data now is that high-performing 3PLs, right, they're starting to leverage all of those data points, as we discussed with paperless warehousing, and they know their costs, right? They know their costs for each service, and they know where to mark things up to account for the actual business value that they're providing to their customer. And it allows that warehouse, or allows the 3PL to actually open up that dialogue with their customer to make sure that they're able to hit those SLAs, to be able to make sure that they're able to hit the service level expectations that their customers have around same-day shipping, next-day shipping, 100% accuracy, those types of processes. That is starting to become more important than the pricing conversation in certain avenues. Right? An example of this would be it's easier to build a quality assurance charge into a standard pallet receiving fee, as opposed to making that an hourly charge billed after the fact, right? How do you blend that average cost of an hourly, QA fee or QC fee or QA fee into just the process of receiving in a pallet? Again, it makes things far more transparent and far more simplified, right? Also starting to see high-performing warehouses apply that simplification method to things like recurring storage. Fewer and fewer requests for things like high watermarks, right? Even anniversary date billing, as we look at the data, we're seeing less and less of that. Customers want to see that blended rate of storage upon receipt, and then maybe snapshot data as they go month to month. So again, some transitions that we're seeing there in sort of that 3PL industry that you might want to take note of. All right, so I've got one more story here. Back in the day, I did used to run warehouse operations. And when we were receiving, we'd receive on just paper tally sheets, right? And so we'd be reliant on someone writing down, well, how many pallets did we receive? And what types of pallets were they? And what customer did they belong to? And then at the end of the month, we'd sort of go sheet by sheet and try to calculate, well, how much are we going to bill this client? How many pallets did we receive? And when you start to combine that with hundreds of tally sheets, dozens of customers, and really what I would call an unmanageable pricing tariff. It would take us weeks to be able to invoice a customer and put all of those things together. And then the worst part is I knew that we were leaving money on the table because I knew we were missing billable events. So when I look back at it now, I do say we have to face it, right? As a 3PL, sometimes you are beholden to your customer. And even if you simplify tariffs down to sort of the lowest common denominator, you still need to be flexible around rates and billing structures for things like volume and history and projections. And so when I start to look at it now and I see what our customers are doing and what warehouses in the industry are doing, they're starting to combine like the simplified tariffs with sort of flexible pricing models, right, as well as variable billing schedules, ensuring that we're able to capture all of the billable events, right, and more importantly, manage cash flow. So from a receiving perspective, I see lots of 3PLs, they prefer to invoice their customers individually for every container that they devan or every truck that they sort of unload. And having rules-based automation for capturing those types of charges, it allows the warehouse to submit invoices same day to the services or for the services that are being performed, right? And this is like far better than waiting till the end of the billing period and potentially floating the customer thousands of dollars, right? Like warehouses can be pretty leveraged between labor and utilities and overhead. It's better to be able to capture and bill accurately as soon as possible if your tariffs are flexible enough to be able to accommodate that. All right, so back to paperless processing for just a minute because it kind of ties together. As much as I see warehouses sort of strive for that 100% automation, it turns out that receiving workflows actually lend themselves to more exceptions than a lot of other processes in the warehouse. So a good example of this would have been that case of the shifted load that we looked at earlier. The need to repalletize a shifted load, it's just one of those exceptions that you're never going to be able to plan for. But you do need to be able to capture it in line with the automated charges. So what we're finding is that customers or warehouses that can't automate the capture of this sort of handling event because you just don't know it's going to be there, right? Those warehouses deploy tools for easy accessorial capture out on the warehouse floor. And it turns out that those interfaces allow the warehouseman on the floor to sort of enter those exception charges in real time, tie those in specifically to the transaction that they're working on, seamlessly integrate with sort of the automated billing piece of it without the need for all of that back office input, and it ultimately makes everything look like a seamless process, especially to the customer as they get their invoices and as they pay those invoices out. So if you talk about a best practice for sort of the billing side of the fence today, it really comes down to minimizing exceptions by building blended rate tariffs into each task that you have. Having too many exceptions out there is really going to limit your ability to automate that billing process, right? It's going to put all of that work back on that manual tally sheet, and it's going to delay your invoicing, and it's going to impact your cash flow. Just a quick aside, I don't have a slide on this, but as we look at more and more e-commerce and how that fulfillment is happening and how that pricing is happening, we're starting to see what I would call the supplier or the manufacturer or the vendor or whoever's selling the goods. They're starting to ask for things like an all-in per unit rate, right? So if we ship a widget, I want to know how much is it going to cost to receive that widget, store that widget, ship that widget, and I want to pay you that price per widget as opposed to a separate receiving fee, storage fee, outbound handling fee. It's a real shift for how we've typically seen, especially in the B2B world, want to handle some of their pricing. So it's an interesting world that we're living in now. All right, so quickly to wrap this up, there were several areas that high-performing warehouses focused on to sort of maximize their profits through best practice receiving operations. Implementing a well-thought-out warehouse layout and layering in system-driven directed put-away. It helps minimize the risk, maximize available space, and really optimize all of the other processes that are going to happen in that warehouse workflow all the way through the outbound shipping. Also seeing high-performing warehouses moving beyond mobile scanning into what we would call now true paperless warehousing or paperless operations. This empowers their employees to sort of interact with the business in real time. They know what to expect. provide immediate feedback, right? And having all of that information sort of available in real time, that's what's key to maximizing operating efficiency in the warehouse. And I would say that the other byproduct of that paperless warehousing, right, it's the enablement of those data metrics that allow the warehouse or the business to quickly benchmark the performance, iterate on workflows, and sort of measure those improvements, right? And the faster you can do this, the more scale you're going to have, the more change that you can impact, and the better your operations are going to be, right? This is really a must-have. I talk about high-performing warehouses throughout this presentation, this is what high-performing warehouses do to remain high-performing warehouses in their industry. So, having that data capture is just a must-have to sort of keep pace. And then finally, I just want to sort of reiterate on the best practices of automated billing and pricing tariffs. That all-in rate structure tied to specific tasks such as a receiving handling, that's going to minimize exceptions. It's going to improve the cash flow. It's going to make invoicing more transparent to the customer. It's just about simplification. And in this world with so much stuff going on and so many different layers, being able to simplify and make things easy, that is what customers are looking for when they identify a 3PL that they want to handle their business. All right. So that concludes what I wanted to talk about today. Mike, it looks like we do have some time left, hopefully for some questions. Maybe I'll open up back to you, and you can take it from there.
Absolutely, David. No, great job today. Fantastic job. And I really love the way these slides were structured, the best practices you left us with in each of the sections. I just thought that was just terrific. David, well done. We do have a number of questions rolling in. Guys, we do have a few minutes here to tackle a few questions. So we'll get to as many as we can in the time we have remaining. And the ones we don't get to will be packaged up, as I mentioned at the outset, and we moved over to David, and he'll be able to he'll be able to get back to the email to answer those questions. David, as we roll through a couple of questions, I'm just going to go back and just hang out on that key takeaway slide as these questions roll in, because I just think these are just terrific to have resonate with our attendees today as we wrap up. David, a couple of questions coming in here, and you did mention a slide on some scanning technology earlier. So, question for David: can you talk a little bit more about the scanning technology warehouses are using today? What are you seeing in the warehouses being used today?
Got it. Sure. Okay. Yeah. From a pure mobile solution, right? We're talking about barcode scanning now. Really, that's what it sounds like. We sort of break customer usage down into sort of three different categories, right? So you would have sort of a warehouse grade device, what we would call a retail grade device, and then you hear a lot about consumer grade devices, and that's going to be things like your iPhones or your smartphones. Honestly, a majority of the customers that we service, right, they swear by that industry standard Motorola or Zebra device. I mean, those things are gold standard. They're rugged. They take the drop. They take all the beatings, and especially nowadays, the technology is so good in those for long-range scanning, the imagers that are on there, the adaptability to be able to, put RFID into the solution or whatever it may be. That is something from a receiving perspective, especially, that we would see a warehouse gravitate towards. Now, as we talk more about e-commerce, the in-close pick, pack, ship, we're definitely seeing some growth in sort of what I would call that retail category. And that would be more like a ruggedized device, a tablet that would have a really high-end short-range scanner to scan like UPC barcodes, shipping labels, things of that nature. They're still rugged. They're still sort of, commercial based, I suppose. But pretty useful now. And then, finally, I talked a little bit about that consumer grade. Obviously, we field lots of questions for consumer grade. In smaller operations, someone that was running their own business for a while, less than 20 or 50 orders a day. Like, sure, you can try it. I know there's point solutions out there that those things make sense. They don't work in an industry environment or an industrial environment quite as well as we would hope. If you were to layer in like a Bluetooth scanner on top of that, or you put it in a sled, like, there's definitely some functionality there and usability that makes sense. Where I really like that consumer grade device, though, is more along the lines of like that KPI tracking and sort of like a more management view,
right?
Like one layer up out of the operation. But
gotcha.
at the end of the day, and what we're telling our customers today is one size doesn't fit all. You're going to have lots of different devices in your warehouse to be able to be as efficient at every process. Good question.
Right.
And I could talk all day about mobile scanning.
Yeah, no, it is an excellent question. And, we, for a while there, we were seeing a few, instances, and we were hearing about it in the market, bring your own device, right, in some of the smaller operations. Meanwhile, iPhones, Androids, et cetera. But then, yes, to a certain degree and a certain point, sure, it's going to work. But once you get, as you mentioned so nicely, David, once you get into, really into the flow of that ruggedized work, I mean, look out. You're looking at nothing but, a lot of drops and shattering and everything else. So there's a whole new niche, too, for those protective devices. I'm sure you're seeing a lot of those protective pieces of equipment that wraps around those consumer-grade pieces. So, that's a good way to put it. I like the idea of that, using that for more of a management type of, or like a labor management type of workflow. Makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
A couple more questions, David, but we have some time. Here's one for David. With directed put away, what sort of rules are being used to minimize travel time? That's a good question, too.
Yeah. We touched on that as a best practice, but we didn't necessarily dive fully into that. From a direct, if you look at all of these different formulas that are out there that talk about the cost per step that a warehouseman takes, or the injuries per step, or the amount of feet moved. No matter how you look at it, it's pretty clear that minimizing human forklift traffic in the warehouse is a good thing, right? We want to minimize that for safety. We want to minimize it for efficiency. And so when we talk to warehouses about directed put away and how they should sort of set up their facilities, you don't need to be so intense around directing maybe every, the compliance piece of it. Right? Start with something basic like, hey, let's use some of the data that we have to analyze your velocity. What products are coming in and which ones are going out the fastest? Let's look at your replenishment sophistication, right? I mean, are you just all bulk storage? Are you actually doing some sort of daily replenishment or some sort of interleaving of replenishment? What does your product handling and mix look like? Do you need forklifts or is this all pick and pack? Understanding all of those different components about how the entire operation is going to work, that's what allows you to sort of build in now those rules around directed put away. And because you can sort of solidify on the basics, right? Well, what locations am I going to use? And what are the attributes of this item? And again, the attributes are not lengthy, but they're powerful. And that's what's going to allow you to have all of that data, all of those key metrics, and allow you to essentially be able to say, wow, my high velocity items, I should put them away in a location that I can get to really quickly, right? By the front door, or the ones that are going to be, all the small parcel, inventory. Well, we should probably put that towards our pick lines, and we should probably put that towards our packing stations and all of those other things. And so, again, it doesn't have to be compliance as part of that project. But, again, it's just that common sense thing that says, wow, this is how this product is going to ship out. Why don't I sort of stage or set myself up for success on the inbound and then have the system do all of the work for me, right? And so that's kind of what we mean by minimizing travel time. Set yourself up well for what's going to happen on the back end of the process, right? By implementing that into the receiving process.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. No, that makes a lot of sense and well described. David, we do have time for one more quick question here. And don't forget, folks, everybody attending, we do have a number of questions. Again, we're going to package all those up, and David will be able to get back to you via email on those, so we will get to all your questions. And this is a billing question. This is another really good question, and I'm sure a lot of folks in attendance today are in a similar situation. Question for David. We're processing B2B orders as well as e-commerce orders for the same customer. Is there a best practice around billing for such different services? Another great question.
I think I heard what you said. My phone cut out for just a second. It sounded like the question was around processing both business-to-business orders and e-commerce orders for the same customer?
For the same customer, that's right. Is there a best practice around billing for such different services? Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. So we would call this, and right, wrong, or indifferent, we would sort of classify that as like omni-channel fulfillment, right? Where there's lots of different marketplaces. You're doing a little bit of B2B, a little bit of B2C, but all for that same customer, maybe some drop shipping. So we see that all the time. And really, even though it feels like when I ship something small parcel versus an LTL load or a full truckload are very different, like at the end of the day, billing best practices, they just hold true regardless, right? You're going to want to know what's coming in before it arrives. You're going to want to know, if you can, where is it supposed to go before it gets there. The simplification of the tariff to automate billing for as much of those services down to sort of that unit level. I gave that quick anecdote about e-commerce fulfillment shops now. They want to know down to the unit level, like what is this going to cost me for that pick, pack, and ship? And you can also, again, like if you start to look at things like, well, how is the shipping, the capacity, the carrier that you're using, how is it packed, right? Is this a pallet, or is this a carton, or is this an overpack or a mailer? Having data points like that to key in off of as well. Again, as long as you've got some flexibility and some automation in the build out of your billing rules and your tariffs, systems should be able to accommodate or understand, okay, wow, this is an e-commerce or B2C versus a B2B order. And even if you have two different tariff structures, again, as long as you can automate around it, like you can get a little bit fancy. But at the end of the day, again, like things kind of hold true, right? The simpler, the better. That's where I would go with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, David Miller, terrific job today, sir. Wonderful job of putting these best practices into perspective for our attendees. And we also, again, want to thank 3PL Central for making this possible. And we want to thank everybody for attending. And again, as I said earlier, we have a number of questions here. We're moving those over to David. He'll get back to you via email. Well, David Miller, great job, sir. We want to thank you for sharing this with us today. Well done.
Thank you, Mike. So nice to be here with you. I appreciate you having me, and I look forward to catching up with everybody soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. We appreciate it. And everybody, have a terrific day. Thanks again.